Hi and welcome to my channel. I'm Mark on RC 74. In today's episode of my rebuild of the full-scale Scrappy built by Patey, I'm going to give you a first look on the shock absorbers, and there are some other topics of the build progress I did so far. So let's jump right into the details. The shock absorbers I choose for this build are made by Kingkong RC. You can get these shocks at AliExpress. The reason why I have chosen these shocks are that I was looking for shocks which are pretty close to the design of the full-scale Scrappy shock absorbers, and I think the look of these is pretty close to what Mike Patey built on his full-scale Scrappy. In a set of these shock absorbers you get two pieces of the shock already fully mounted but no oil filled in, so only spring loaded, and you also get a spare set of pivot point rubbers, and you also get a spare set of pivot point steel tubes. Then you have a little drawing where you can see how the shock absorber is built up. For the first installation I will install it in dry condition with no oil, just to check the setup for the springs and check the length and the travel of the suspension. These shock absorbers have a length from hole to hole of about 10.5 centimeters. You can get them in different lengths, I think from 70 millimeters up to 105, or these 10.5 centimeters. This is the longest version, and this is the version I use for the main suspension. For the rear suspension I think I'm gonna go for a shorter shock absorber, but will be the same design. The screw holes are made for M3 screws. The travel these shock absorbers have is around 3 centimeters, so I think this will work pretty great for the RC Scrappy build. The installed springs are way too soft, fully compressed. They push around 450 grams, and middle position they are around 250 grams. And the RC Scrappy will be around 4 kilograms ready to fly, including the battery. I'm pretty sure that these are way too weak, and I already ordered some way stronger springs which should exactly fit into the shock absorber to handle the 4 kilogram ready to fly weight of my RC Scrappy. The color of the shock absorbers will change for sure. I won't keep the red color. Not sure yet which color I will choose. This depends on the final color scheme the whole Scrappy build will have at the end. Then let's have a look at the first part of the shock mount I installed into the fuselage. This is a similar construction like you have it on a RC off-road buggy. This is a shock mount bridge, so it's one piece through the whole fuselage which connects both pair of shock absorbers. This makes it very stiff and avoids any bending or moving of the shock absorber bridge in the fuselage. Fortunately, the fuselage has an open area on the lower side. I was lucky enough to have a great position of this cut in the fuselage to install the suspension bridge exactly at this position. To figure out where I had to cut the opening for the shock absorber bridge, I used a 2mm steel rod, just sharpened one end of the steel rod and pushed it from the lower side through the sidewall of the fuselage, and so I had the mark on the side of the fuselage where I had to cut the whole opening for the carbon part. Then I masked the area where I had to cut the fuselage, cut it both openings, also used a file to make the cut a little wider to fit the 1.5mm carbon plate I used for the shock absorber mount. Then I draw the template of the shape of the shock absorber mount on carton, mask the whole carbon part, draw the shape of the mount onto the carbon, cut out the carbon, shaped it with some sanding. First I did just the raw shape, checked if I can put it into the fuselage, and after everything fitted well, I cut it and sanded the final shape of the carbon part, drilled the holes for the shock absorbers, and also drilled a bunch of holes in the center area of the part just to remove a little bit of weight and also make it easier for the epoxy I poured into the fuselage gap to fill up every area and glue on every area of the carbon part. Then I sanded the whole area where the glue connects the carbon part and the fuselage just to get better grip for the 24-hour epoxy I used to glue the carbon part into the fuselage. And it was time to pour some epoxy into the fuselage gap and also put some epoxy onto the carbon part, slided it sideways into the fuselage. There was a little surprise because there are some tiny gaps between the different foam parts of the fuselage, and some of the epoxy ran through the fuselage and there was a little mess, but fortunately no big deal, so I was able to clean up everything. So the result looks pretty promising. The carbon mount sits pretty strong into the fuselage. You can really push hard on it and it doesn't move at all. Then it was time for the final installation of the wheel axles and also making the wheel lock system and install the whole wheels. The 4mm brass tubes had a little bit of play in the 5mm tubes of the knuckles, so I had to be careful to solder the 4mm axles in the exact same angle on both sides into the knuckles, so the wheels really stand the same angle in the final installation. To do the soldering of the axles, I had to remove the knuckles, prepare the axles for soldering, then soldered both axles, and after this I had to clean some solder out of the 4mm tube just to make sure the carbon tubes I also glue into the 4mm brass tubes will have a perfect fit without any drag. Then I did an axle fit check on the wheels just to make sure that there is no more solder on the axles, which avoid to put the wheels in perfect position on the axle, but everything was fine. Then I checked if the carbon tubes fit into the brass tubes. Everything looked good, so I cut the carbon tubes, sanded the whole surface to get more grip for the 24-hour epoxy. Then I had to mask the axles to avoid a lot of epoxy on the axles. Then I was ready to glue in the carbon tubes with 24-hour epoxy into the brass tubes to reinforce the brass tubes to carry the weight of the RC Scrappy. The brass tubes itself won't be strong enough to carry these 4 kilograms and also some hits on landings and starts. So I'm pretty sure the combination of carbon and brass will be strong enough to carry RC Scrappy's weight. After the epoxy was completely cured, it was time to unwrap the axles and did the first check of the wheels if they fit on the axle, and everything looked good. For the wheel lock, I chose stock drives from my RC race boat, which are originally made to keep the propeller in position on a flex shaft. These are aluminum, so they are pretty lightweight, and I decided to change the shape to make them fit on the wheels. So I cut them into the right shape, shaped and sanded them down on both sides to a round shape, and I think the result looks pretty nice. Then I did also a wheel check if the wheels spin perfectly free. When I installed the dog drives, everything fits absolutely perfect. I have no play on the wheels, and the ball bearings do a perfect job on this installation. Then I had to cut down the overlength of the axles and sanded and polished the axle ends and installed the whole axle and the wheels, and the end result looks pretty nice. Then I did the last finish on the knuckles, on the brass knuckles. They were opened on top and bottom side of the 10mm brass tube, and I decided to make carbon caps to close top and bottom side of the knuckles. For this I glued some pieces of carbon onto screws with UHU Por. This glue is perfectly removable, also after it's totally cured. So I glued the carbon pieces I have cut off onto the screws, put the screws into my drill and cut the caps into a perfect round shape. The screws had a head diameter of 9.8 millimeters and the brass tubes are around 10 millimeters, so they have a perfect fit. And I also sanded a little step into the carbon caps just to make it possible that the caps dive a little bit into the brass tubes but do not drop into the brass tubes. To keep them in place on the brass tubes, I used some CA glue from UHU. This is really strong and super quick glue, so I glued them into the brass tubes, and I think the final look of the brass tubes is pretty nice. Then I finally also cut down the 2.1mm rods on the fuselage side to the right length, just to give the suspension a clean look. Then I began the work on the rear wheel suspension. The full-scale Scrappy also has a custom-made rear wheel suspension. It's a trailing arm with a free-moving wheel, so the wheel is not connected with the rudder function. The wheel can spin 360 degrees around, and that's the exact same solution I wanna build on RC Scrappy. So first I chose a wheel to make it look more like the original Scrappy. The stock wheel is pretty narrow and the custom wheel I use is almost double the width of the original wheel, and I think this will fit the look of Scrappy way more than the stock wheel. Stock shape of the custom wheel I use was not really a round nice tire shape, so I decided to put the screws through the wheel hole, put the wheel into the drill and sanded down the wheel or the tire to a nice round shape. So like this the tire looks way more scale. Then I started to work on the first custom part of the rear wheel suspension. This is the connection part which will sit between the wheel mount itself and the trailing arm, which will be installed on the fuselage. And this was a pretty tricky part because I had to make a solution which is not too big and not too heavy, but also provides the function of a free spinning 360 spinning wheel. And this is the part, just the raw shape I did so far. To make this part I used 4mm carbon from a broken drone frame. I crashed last year in the mountains, so the carbon is still in good condition to build such parts. So the middle plate is a 4mm drone arm carbon part. Then I added 2 plates on top, on bottom side to wrap the ball bearings. I decided to design the 360 spinning solution with 2 ball bearings. These have the size of 9mm outer diameter, inner hole is 4mm and also width is 4mm. And I cut out all the plates, cut them into the right shape. To install the ball bearings in a perfect fit into these carbon plates, I first drilled 9mm holes through all the separate parts. On the top plate I drilled the 9mm hole just partly, and the top end of the plate is only 7mm. That helps to avoid to push the ball bearings through the carbon plates. Then I sanded all the surfaces of the plates to get more grip for the CA glue I used to glue the plates together. Then glued all the plates together, already with mounted ball bearings, and like this the glue keeps all the parts perfectly together. Then I shaped down the carbon part with sanding to the raw shape you can see now. This is not the final shape at all. I will reduce the width and also the length and the end shape to all narrower, smaller parts, so it will reduce some weight, and I think I can also improve the look a little bit. To make the M3 screw fit into the 4mm hole of the ball bearings, I took a 4mm outer diameter brass tube, which has exactly 3mm inner diameter, cut it into the right length, had to polish down the outer side to make it fit perfect into the bearings with no play. This also helps to make it possible to tighten up the screw without pushing on the ball bearings, and with this solution the ball bearings can really work absolutely free. There is no friction of the tightened up screw on the ball bearings, so I'm pretty happy with the solution so far. I also drilled the holes to install the connection part into the trailing arm, which will be one of the next parts I'm gonna start to build. This is the progress so far on my RC Scrappy build. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope you liked the video. Have a good time. Happy flying. Bye bye.